Hello everyone. So I just wanted to talk about something very interesting today. How we have this common conception that the past was a very backward time as compared to today, and for good reason. It was backward. And the reason we have this perception, the reason this perception exists is because of how rampant injustice was at the time, at how people were treated differently depending on which class or sect they belonged to, and so on and so forth, and how there was so many feudal systems existing in so many societies all over the world, and how we had these various class systems, and there was so much oppression and all of that stuff, and also because of stuff like superstition, or how religion had a big played a big role in governments, not governments but basically in have in religions had a lot of say when it came to ruling over the people and stuff like that. So because of all these things, we tend to have a view that those were very backward times, and we feel that the modern age, us today, we feel that we are completely different from those times. These times are completely different, and we feel that these are more equal times, and we have stronger systems of government and stronger government democrat and we have democratic institutions and stuff like that. So because of all these things, we generally tend to look at the past, medieval history or ancient history as a bygone era, a time past, and we look at us as people as completely different human beings than the human beings who existed. Then we tend to look at each other as completely different species almost. We look at when you watch a movie, when you watch a soldier or a aristocrat in their laden in their robes, we never feel like we belong to the same thread. We feel like we are completely different people, and that is true in a lot of ways, but there are actually many more similarities than we would care to admit. There are so many crazy things. So for example, I just want to talk about how one of the biggest things that we usually look at when we talk about how different we are from the olden times is equality and justice and stuff like that, and how justice was not as easily accessible to people back then as it is today, and how the peasants were much more oppressed than they were today, and how luxuries were not affordable to everyone and stuff like that, and how in general the value of human life has risen, the standard of living has risen. So all of everything usually circles back to the judicial system and stuff like that. So if you actually look at it, even in medieval Europe, in England, back in the 1400s, back in around that time, they had a very, you'll be shocked to realize that they actually had a very robust legal system, and the law was very comprehensive, and they tackled almost everything. And this should actually not be a shock, because even back in ancient history or dating back to the dark ages, laws have always been pretty comprehensive. It's almost as if it is an innate human ability to generally just come up with rule, not just come up, but I mean it seems to be a human characteristic to form societies and to have rules and have laws over everybody that everyone has to abide to and stuff like that. So it shouldn't be a shock, but it still does, because of this perceived distance, because of how far we feel we are from the medieval ages, and because of this, and we are really far, but because of all that, we feel like we've come a really long way, a very long way, and we have in many ways, because we no longer have slavery. We are fighting for equality, and we have the spectrum of gender identities and sexual identities and all of this stuff, and so we are a more progressive and more open society on a whole, a more open world and more accepting world. But when it comes to many important things, many fundamental building blocks, as I was saying, the judicial system. So if you consider England, even back then, the 1400s, they had a very comprehensive legal system, and you could even sue the king, not the ruling monarch, not the king of England, but so there was a whole ruling hierarchy. You had the king right at the top, and then you had like a couple of people below him, and then you had the nobles and the lords and so on and so forth. So you would have these dukes and these princes and these kings who were basically under the king, and they would rule over these. They would rule over their domains, their parts of land. So there have been many noted instances of warlords or normal barons or people holding positions of responsibilities in fortresses at the borders, and you have accounts of those sort of people who are not noble folk suing kings or suing dukes or princes, basically the king presiding over their jurisdiction. So it's actually very crazy that not only did they have comprehensive laws, but they were even able to apply it, because you can see that a guy who is in charge of a castle at a border, his basic duty is defense. And there's a big difference when you consider the class system between the position the baron is at and the position the duke or the king over his particular jurisdiction, that particular domain is at. And for this guy to be able to file a case against him, and they had stuff like they could directly appeal the king of England, and so on and so forth. So you can see how robust the system was even then, and how effective it was. I mean, obviously it wasn't accessible to the common man at all, which is true, and which is also true today. The legal system still is not very accessible to the common man, although it has made many like miles worth of leaps over what it was back then. But you can still imagine the significance as compared to our present day perception over the past. So that's actually very crazy. And the other thing is how our democratic institutions, the things that we consider to be the pinnacle of our modern age of today, it is actually crazy how, although it has been an evolutionary process of so many governments, thousands of years, so many governments, so many various forms of governance, and so many various forms of elections and representation, and so on and so forth, we have these great institutions and great processes and mechanisms today. But if you actually go back to even over 1,000 years ago, over 1,600 or 2,000 years ago, more than 2,000 years ago, back to the Roman Empire, which was even before the medieval ages, even before England, even as far as that, and one second. So even as far back as that, and you still have elections, you still have semi-democratic institutions. Actually, you could consider them to be democratic for that day and age. And the crazy thing is how we consider ourselves to be the pinnacle of civilization, or the most modern and the most open time. Almost every single age has felt like that. The 17th century felt like it was the most open and most progressive age, and the 18th century felt like it was the most progressive age. And today we are feeling the same thing. And so did the Romans, and so did the people in Athens and Greece. And so if you look at it, this is pretty much what I'm trying to point at. The cyclic recurrence of human behavior and human behavior in human systems. Basically, it's like, so what I'm trying to point at is humans have not changed entirely, contrary to what we think. We haven't changed completely. It's just that the things around us have changed. We have more resources, we have better tools, we have we have more opportunities at hand, we have more food at hand, and so our behavior has completely changed. What I'm basically trying to say is, so back in the medieval ages, when we had what we consider to be a very oppressive class system, and we had feudalism. So if you actually look at it, we might consider it to be a very primitive or a very backwards and primitive way of living. But if you actually look at it, back then food was scarce. They had this whole great famine thing, which was basically like years and years of famine. If you can imagine that, like people had no food for like years and years. There was one winter or something, and the temperature just chilled and cooled, and they could not sow seeds, they could not harvest. They ran out of food for the livestock, for the cows and stuff, and they just ran out of food, and prices just skyrocketed. And this is another thing. It is crazy how even 1,000 years ago they had such a robust economic system, so well thought out. So, and economics was an actual thing back then. They had debt, they had national debt, they had bonds, they had everything, and they would not just they didn't just come up with money, even though they could have. The king could have just said, the king's vote was final, he could have just said, and they could have just come up with money, but they always struggled. The advisors would always tell the king that, we are running out of money, we are in debt, and we can borrow money from France or from some other kingdom, or we can have a tie. And so even back then, economies were a huge thing, huge, and just like so well thought out, and it was exactly as it was today, maybe even bigger, because back then everything was physical. There was no okay, forget, this is out of scope, but you get the idea. So they ran out of food and people were dying, and this went on for years and years. So obviously you cannot imagine that. But the point I'm trying to make is, life back then was pretty tough, pretty difficult, and survival was the main thing. Like today, survival is not. Today the question is not of survival; it is of having a dignified and decent and a life of a higher standard, of achieving, of ambition. But back then, life was mainly about survival, and especially as a kingdom or as a group of, because even we humans are organisms, we too are animals. So as a pack of animals, or just as organisms, so as a group, the whole thing was actually very economical. So this whole feudal system, this whole class system that was oppressive in nature, that is of no doubt. But this whole system, then the one thing that people seem to miss is it was calculated, as was life back then, because life was about survival. And when food was not in abundance, as I just said, people were dying for years because they had no food. Like they simply could not even sow they could not sow seeds. The seeds were spoiled. Whatever they did sow, they could not harvest, and stuff like that. So they had no options, and you can see how fragile life was back then, how vulnerable society was as a whole. Not just society, but just kingdoms as a whole. Entire civilizations could just be wiped out because food security was not a thing. It was just like there was no food security, and there was no real security either. You could just have. So the Roman Empire was so huge, and they went on so many campaigns all over the world, so many conquests. They even conquered so many kingdoms, and they had this huge, massive government that was ruling all over the world, and it just fell, just crashed. And so you can see how fragile and how vulnerable things were back then. And especially, so the Roman Empire fell. It was there for thousands of years. It was so successful, exactly like us today. Everything was going great, and then it just fell. And even before the ruins could be cleared out, even before it could become the past, we had the Anglo-Saxon settlements and the Viking invasions, and just so you can see how crazy life was back then. There were constant attacks. You never knew what would happen the next day. Anything would happen. The king could die. There would be a war. Anything would happen. So you can just see how life was back then, and especially considering stuff like that. So when you look at society as a whole, as like when you look at society as a whole, and you look at kingdoms, and you realize that the main focus was to keep the kingdom secure, to keep the people secure, to keep the kingdom standing as a whole, to keep the group alive, to keep the whole alive at the cost of a few individuals, which is where this whole class system started, where people were basically their work. They would belong to different classes, and the class system was integrated with the work system, and people belonging to a certain rung of the hierarchy would be related to a certain work, and so on. And so the main thing at that time was security, and not just in terms of food but in terms of war and stuff like that. So what was happening was all of these people, these peasants and these farmers, were obviously being oppressed, which is of no question. They were being oppressed, but the way this whole thing started was that you would have a king or you would have a lord who would take care of a certain region or of a certain huge patch of land, an entire community with a lot of people living there who would till the land, so etc., blacksmiths and so on and so forth. So you would have a certain class of people growing the food, and these were the people oppressed the most because they had nothing else. All they did was grow the food, and they would give this food as tribute to the Lord and his men, who would guarantee protection. And because without his protection, there was no point. There was no community without protection, and the peasants were the most vulnerable class because all they could do was grow food. That was all they could do. And so, as the natural order of things fell into place, these people ended up at the bottom, the most oppressed, and there was nothing they could do about it. And especially because they had to keep growing food, they couldn't just stop growing food one day. So you can see how this was an arrangement of necessity more than anything else. More than anything else, it was an arrangement of necessity. Even religion and superstitions, more than being, and they were inbuilt. They were the shortcomings on a personal and mental level. But when you look at history, you realize that, and even today, these were and are things that are manipulated by groups of people to meet their higher ends, to meet their goals, and they are rarely ever a thing in themselves. Very rarely, and the people who do consider them in a very personal manner are the ones who get manipulated by the people using these things to manipulate the manipulable people for their ends. So even the Holy Crusades and the war against France, which was egged on by the I don't remember what they were called, the religious advisor or whatever to the king, and so stuff like that. So what you start seeing, if you actually notice, is things haven't changed a lot. The peasant class was being oppressed back then, and today we have the farmers being oppressed in so many countries, so many developing countries, and the class system it no longer exists explicitly. It has been diluted, but that is the whole point. It no longer exists explicitly. It has merely been diluted. You can still find hints of this whole thing because you still have the rich people running the corporations or running their family businesses, and the politicians and the bureaucrats. They simply are your modern day aristocrats, which I'm not saying this in a bad way, but I'm trying to point out to you the cyclic recurrence of how human systems simply exist. This is simply another manifestation of the basic human system. The only difference is we have better tools, we have high precision machinery, we have better agricultural technology and better agricultural studies, and so we don't have to go through great famines because we know we have resiliencies, we have hybrid seeds, we have so much stuff, we have an abundance of food. Even though so many people are starving, it isn't because there is no food. There is an abundance of food to feed the world 10 times over, but it's just that it's just business. It's just the way the world runs. It's a very transactional and calculated thing, exactly like it was back then, calculated and economical. The main thing about the oppression of the lower classes is the peasant classes. So you have them not donating, but paying tribute of money or food grains. Not just the peasant class, even the merchant class. So they keep paying these tributes, and all of this just keeps going up to the lords, the princes, the king, and so on and so forth. And so you think, oh, at the top there's this accumulation of wealth, and at the bottom there is none. And if you think about that, is simply the way human systems have always functioned. Even in antiquity, even in the dark ages, even today in the modern age, even in the future, it will always be the way that somehow the water just percolates upwards instead of flowing downwards. Wealth is always accumulated at the top, and that is simply the nature of human society, of human hierarchies, of how our social groups are formed. And so You look at these people and you think they were backward, and we think, but the truth is we are not so far from them. We are very close to them, and the only the one of the main reasons how we have managed to move so far away from how the world was back then to what it is today is basically how life has become easier, because we can mine for resources easier. It is easier to get wood is easier, to get coal is easier than what it was back then. We have gigantic crazy machinery. We have so many crazy technologies, and just living has become cheaper because of all of these things, because of the technological advances mainly. Because of that, business has been able to we have been able to conduct business more easily, and because of all of these things coming together, we have had radical progressive changes in terms of society, or in terms of how people perceive each other and how they live, and how basically justice has become affordable. Back then it wasn't. If all the presidents said we can't pay, we refuse to pay the tribute, we refuse to pay to the king. So then what happens? The army falls, the king cannot pay soldiers, and let me remind you, all of this was operating on debt. Even back then, even in the medieval ages, all of this was operating on debt. So the king can't pay his wages, and now the king can't pay the soldier their wages. There is no army, the kingdom falls apart, money ruins everything, and so the pressure was on the peasant class, and they had to deliver, because otherwise there would be no kingdom, there would be nowhere for the peasants to live. It's crazy, but that's exactly how the world operates today too. So many farmers, blue collar workers, people who work in factories, they make it possible for us to have our products, for us to have all of our things, and they're pretty much like the peasant class. They get oppressed. They have no rights. Someone works in a factory, and someone works at a plant, and maybe faces radiation, and then there's no one reimburses him, or no one covers his health costs. And similarly, maybe someone works at a plant and gets injured, or they have no rights, no one fights for them, and it was similar to what the peasant class was back then. And another thing is so you can just see how these things are common, these things have been common, and as distant as we consider the past to be, it is almost as if we carry the past around with us, because in some way all of these things are somehow almost an innate characteristic of human systems, of our social systems. And another thing that I wanted to talk about was basically the military, and how they had huge militaries even back in the day, and people who fight for their country and actually die, fight all the time and die on battlefields in gruesome ways, and they probably had huge crowds fighting. People probably had suffocation on the battlefield because of just so many people just crammed up against each other. But anyway, the point is, so they had these huge militaries, and they had armor, which is crazy, because if you think about it, these people considered to be backwards and so different from us were so capable and so skilled of coming up with this whole concept of armor, of melting and molding metal into parts that you could wear that protect you from swords, from all sorts of weapons and chainmail and stuff like that protects you from arrows. And we even had doctors back then, which is another thing. But so this whole blacksmiths and metallurgy and all that stuff it's advanced. It is quite advanced, and especially for back then. And they did it with whatever they had. So the thing that you can see is they did have a scientific attitude to some extent. They did have technological advances. They were technologically adept. They did come up with various things. And other than the armament, the military had catapults, and they would when they would lay siege to huge castles or huge towns, they would just use these catapults to shoot out huge flaming balls of stones or whatever. And so they did have technology. By the way, technology is not merely information technology or digital technology. Technology that does count as technology, and they had all of this stuff. They were smart enough. They did have the intelligence that we possess. They did have, even some great art has come out of that, and great literature. So they were competent. They were capable. The only thing was they did not have the tools that we had, and obviously these tools have come out after years and years of technological advancement. years and years of so on and so on. So what you can see is basically the the differences that exist between us and them are, in a way, you can say that they are differences afforded to us by the advances and the state our society can afford to live in, because of the level we are at in terms of advancement, how we have how advanced we are in transport and communication, in instant messaging, just just we have organizations that tell you how to run a business, how to run your own organization. We have something for everything. We have a solution to every problem. So many people, and just so many jobs, so many opportunities, so many different things. And it's just society has advanced to a level that everything has become very efficient, very effective. Anything that you want to do, there's an answer for it. Anything that you want to do, you can do it. And all of this is possible because of communication, because of transport, because of business being conducted more openly and efficiently, because of how connected the world is, because of globalization. Things that were not there back then, things that have made our world what it is today, if you can see it. These are things that have made our world what it is today. If they did exist back then it would probably be exactly as it is today. But obviously they did not exist back then, so it's kind of a pointless speculation. But anyway, that what I'm trying to say is how it's as if the world keeps running in cycles. Civilization keeps running in cycles. We had the Indus civilization, advanced, great culture, art, great scientific developments even for that time. We had the Roman Empire, we had the Mesopotamian civilization, and then we had all of that stuff in England and France and just all of that, and we had the Industrial Revolution and all of this stuff. And if you just look at it, it's like we're going around in cycles, but not in a way that we keep going back to the past. We go around in cycles, but we also elevate ourselves. We also keep getting bigger and getting more complicated, and it's almost as if we going through a soft evolution. But you can see the recurrence. Just everything happens. There's always a revolution. There's always we have the virus, the pandemic right now. We had the famines back then. We had the plague. We had the flu. We had stuff like this. It keeps happening. The pandemic, we think it's happening to us, but it's happened. Stuff like this has happened so many times. People were at home for years wearing masks, and people were dying. At least now we have so many deaths, but there are also so many people alive. And especially, a lot of us don't realize it, but the way people were suffering back then, poor people are suffering today in the same way. But the only thing is that the population is more insured. Most of the population is insured today. Back then, none of the population was insured except for the aristocrats and the nobles. Today, almost all the population is insured. And it's not just that we can afford healthcare, but that we are technologically advanced enough to come up with vaccines and stuff like that, and so quickly, and governments are just providing them for free to everyone and stuff like that. So you can see that it is basically like how things keep happening again and again. The difference is that today we are very well equipped to deal with these situations, but then if you look at the situations themselves, they're just things that have been happening from the beginning. Ever since man has been self-conscious and self-aware, these are things that have been happening since way back then. It's just happening again and again. So that was what so I kind of lost track over there, but basically what I was trying to talk about was the cyclic nature of how the recurrence, stuff that keeps happening again and again, and it's actually just the same thing but in a better way, because we keep getting better somehow. So thanks for listening to this.